So we're continuing today with our Dogen Genjo Koan, the koan of everyday life. And although, it sounds very abstract, a lot of it, what Dogen really is talking about is how we experience our life day in and day out. So I'm going to begin by reading you what we've covered so far of the Genjo Koan, and then we'll read the lines for today and talk about them a little bit, see what they might mean. So here's Genjo Koan. When all dharmas are Buddha dharmas, there are delusion and realization, practice, birth and death, Buddhas and living beings. And when the 10,000 dharmas are without self, there is no delusion, no realization, no Buddhas, no living beings, and no death. The Buddha way transcends being and non-being. Therefore, there are birth and death, delusion and enlightenment, living beings and Buddhas. Nevertheless, flowers fall though we love them, and weeds grow though we hate them. To carry the self forward and illuminate the 10,000 things is delusion. When the myriad things come forth and enlighten the self, this is awakening. Those who have great realization of delusion are Buddhas. Those who are greatly deluded about realization are sentient beings. Further, there are those who continue realizing beyond realization, and those who are deluded throughout delusion. When Buddhas are truly Buddhas, they do not necessarily notice that they are Buddhas. However, they are actualized Buddhas, and they go on realizing Buddha. When you see forms and hear sounds with the whole body and mind, even though we are experiencing them directly, it is not like a mirror's reflection. It is not like the water and the moon. While we are experiencing one side, we are blind to the other side. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be awakened by the 10,000 things. When actualized by the myriad things, your body and mind, as well as the bodies and minds of others, drop away. No trace of enlightenment remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. When you ride in a boat and watch the shore, you might assume that the shore is moving. But when you keep your eyes closely on the boat, you can see that it is the boat that moves. Similarly, if you examine the myriad things with a confused body and mind, you may suppose that you have a mind and an essence that are permanent. When you practice intimately and return to where you are, it will be clear that nothing at all has an unchanging self. Okay, that's so far. Here's today. So the lines we have today are kind of longish, but so be it. Interesting. Firewood becomes ash and does not become firewood again. Yet do not suppose that the ash is after and the firewood before. Understand that firewood abides in its condition as firewood and fully includes before and after, while it is independent of before and after. Ash abides in the condition as ash, which fully includes before and after. Just as firewood does not become firewood again after it is ash, you do not return to birth after death. This being so, it is the established teaching of the Buddha Dharma to deny that birth turns into death. Accordingly, birth is understood as beyond birth. It is an unshakable teaching that death does not turn into life. Accordingly, death is understood as beyond death. Birth is a condition complete in this moment. Death is a condition complete in this moment. They are like winter and spring. You do not say that winter becomes spring or that spring becomes summer. Okay, so those are the lines we're going to talk about today. I have to say that those lines were some of the lines when I first read Dogen that caused me to despair and think I would never ever understand what he was talking about. And it's taken me a long time to see even a little of what, Dogen is talking about here. So let's see what we have to learn. In the first line, he says, firewood becomes ash and does not become firewood again. When you read that, you want to say, like, duh. And then he continues with the second line. He says, yet, do not suppose that ash is after and firewood before. Which is exactly what you would suppose, taking a normal point of view. So why is Dogen suddenly talking here about firewood and ash and about past and present? In the paragraph before this one, that was the one where he's talking about when you're in the boat and you're not sure whether the boat is moving or the shore is moving. In that paragraph, he goes from discussing this riding in a boat to making a comparison to more abstract Dharma issues. So in this paragraph, he talks about firewood and ash in the same way. He's using them as images, as symbols, as something concrete, so that he can actually get to more abstract issues. These are everyday images that anybody can relate to. And Dogen is all about trying to help us understand difficult Dharma teachings. So in the paragraph about the boat, Dogen was talking about how we see. And that the way we see depends on our point of view, where we're looking from, what position we're in. So part of what he's trying to say in this current paragraph is to talk about change and transformation, just as firewood and ash are a kind of continuum in a way. He may also be talking about how we transform from our ordinary point of view, our ordinary way of seeing, to an enlightened point of view. And to explain this, he adds the second line, yet do not suppose that ash is after and firewood before. So when he says firewood becomes ash, in the first sentence, you might think that these two states becomes suggest that the two things are connected in time. In this case, firewood and ash. And if he's talking about delusion and enlightenment, you might take it that these two things are connected in time. That delusion comes first and enlightenment comes after, just as you might think firewood comes first and ash comes after. We would generally think what he tells us is not true, that something turns into something else. But what we know about, traditional Buddhist teachings is that they never claim that we become something different, that we turn into enlightened persons. The very first thing that the Buddha said upon his own enlightenment was I and all sentient beings are enlightened together. So that traditional teachings tell us we're already enlightened. So we don't become enlightened. What we do is we just wake up and notice that we are already enlightened. So this is like the firewood and the ash. One thing does not turn into the other. He says, understand that firewood abides in its condition as firewood, which fully includes before and after, while it is independent of before and after. He gives you two contradictory things. It includes it, but it's also independent. So here Dogen is telling us that no such transformation takes place in anything. Nothing turns into anything else, let alone delusion to enlightenment. So how does he figure that? What he's pointing to here is the suchness. He's pointing to what we call things as they are. He's saying that firewood is always just firewood. Ash is always just ash. And he arrives at this view, this is very important, because of the way he understands time. He has a whole thing on called Being Time, a whole fascicle, a chapter of his book, which he writes on time. But his view of time takes a part in every one of his writings. And here's how he thinks about time. It's nothing new. You've heard all this before. So Dogen says that there's only one way in which we actually experience the world firsthand. What is that way? That is the way of being in this very moment. You know, if you think about it, the only thing that is actually tangible, sensory to you is what you're feeling and receiving at this very moment. The rest is memory or anticipation or thoughts in your head. We can never actually be anywhere but this very moment. No way we could be anywhere else when you think about it. You know, John Kabat-Zinn says, wherever you are, there you are. But the rub here is that we don't always acknowledge the experience of the moment. And we definitely don't acknowledge it as all there is a lot of times. Instead, what do? We're prone to view the world from our heads. And we see it in an abstract way, full of concepts of before and after, good and bad, desire and rejection, all sorts of opposing things. So what Dogen is telling us here is that any other way of regarding things outside of the moment takes place in the mind only. In our thoughts, we can hold firewood and ash at the same time. But we can only experience whatever condition the tree is currently in. You know, when it's firewood, we experience firewood. When it's ash, we experience ash. We can't experience both states at once in the moment. So when we think of before and after, past and future, becoming, as we might say, we're caught up in time. You know, time is a very handy concept that we've imposed on the world. It allows us to catch trains and meet people and things of that sort. But, you know, it's an artificial concept. And we've imposed it on the experience of each moment. So in reality, all we really have is each moment and the experience of suchness. In the moment, see, there is no time, because time is a matter of comparison and a linear succession of moments. But if you're only in the one moment, then there's no way to keep track of time. There's just what there is. So this is why Dogen says, understand that firewood abides in its condition of firewood, and ash abides in its condition as ash. You could also say, you could translate that condition maybe as form. Firewood abides in its form as firewood. Ash abides in its form as ash. But what does he mean in the rest of the sentence, where he seems to take back this first statement? He goes on to say that firewood, in all its suchness, fully includes before and after, while it is, at the same time, mind you, independent of before and after. And that ash also fully includes before and after, and likewise would be independent of before and after. So this independence of before and after means that though before and after are contained in each moment when we experience the moment is always confined to right here, right now, without before and after. This is where we live our lives, you know. Before is a memory. After is anticipation or anxiety, depending on how you're feeling about what might come after. And where we live our lives is this little cusp of now, this very moment. So now, suchness is therefore independent of before and after. Things are what they are in each moment, regardless of any past or future condition. This is why Dogen follows up with the next sentence. He says, ash abides in its condition as ash, which fully includes before and after. So this is Zen paradox. How can it be? How can it include before and after, and also abide in now, which has no before and after? So this very moment contains all other moments. So in a sense, each moment holds the past and future of each thing. You know, you can, if you want to make it personal, you can take it as you sit here right now in this moment, you contain all of your past, right? Otherwise, you would be a different you. And if you want to know your future, look at how you are now. You know, your current now contains your future as well. Yet in the moment that we experience firewood or ash, there is no time, no before and after. Each moment fills the whole universe because nothing to compare it to. So it is the whole universe for that moment. So in that sense, each thing is just what it is now. You know, and this way of seeing is a blessing, really. It's how we end a lot of our suffering. When we can be in the moment, what we avoid are a lot of regrets. We might have a lot of regrets about the events that have led up to this moment, but if we are just this moment, then we're not thinking about all that. We're spared a lot of anxiety as well, because if we are in this very moment, we're not anticipating what might come out of this moment that might be bad or scary or upsetting. You know, when I do these talks, I consult other commenters to see, if I'm way off base or if maybe I have some inkling of what Dogen is saying here. And one of the commenters I looked into on this passage tells this story. There's a Japanese monk who was injured in World War II. And as a result of this injury, he had to have both of his legs amputated. And when they told him this, he was, of course, quite upset. But then he thought, he's a monk after all, Buddhist monk. He's trying to live his life according to the Dharma. And so he thinks about how could I handle this, in a different way. He decided that he would be like the firewood. Just as firewood abides in the condition of firewood, where there is no past or future, he will abide in the condition of a double amputee. And no past as a two-legged person, and no future that will be different from that of a double amputee. And what he said was, today is the moment I am born. He might say reborn, but he said born. And he began to live a new life as a person without his legs. So circumstances in our lives are not always this dramatic or difficult, but we can learn a lot about living life as it is and about the end of suffering from this story. So when you hear the story, do you suppose that the monk had no phantom limb distress, or that he did not experience pain in learning to walk with his prosthesis? Of course he had pain. Do you suppose that he did not find life without his legs more difficult than life with his legs? Of course he did. He suffered. But he avoided the additional suffering of bitterness and regret. Oh, poor me, I'm this double amputee and I have more problems than everyone else and I can't do this and I can't do that. And he avoided the obsessive fears about what was to come as a result of his condition. Oh, I won't be able to continue, I'll never get married, he just accepted the condition that he had to accept because there was no choice. So Dogen switches the subject here and makes clear that what his analogy of firewood and ash is really all about. He's been kind of leading up to this. And in the last line he says, just as firewood does not become firewood again after it is ash, you do not return to life after death. So suddenly we're very engaged here. The ultimate transformation that Dogen really wants to talk about in this paragraph is life and death. You could substitute life for firewood and death for ash in this paragraph, and it makes perfect sense if you're talking about life and death, because it is what he's talking about. So the question of life and death is always of great interest to we human beings. If you ever come on Wednesday night here, we do what we call the evening gatha. And it starts out, life and death. Let me respectfully remind you, life and death are of supreme importance. We want to know how we are to live this life, because most of us are pretty inept. It's a complicated, difficult thing. We want to know how we can avoid suffering. And we want to know how we can live a good and happy and useful life. And death, is the great mystery. We want to know what it is. We want to know, is there anything after death? We want to know how we can live without the crippling fear of death. And so Dogen's discussion of life and death is of great interest to us. So this is what he has to say about this. In the next paragraph, he goes on to discuss this life and death very directly. He says, this being so, i.e., you won't come back after you die, it is the established teaching in Buddha Dharma to deny that birth turns into death. Accordingly, birth is understood as beyond birth. It is an unshakable teaching that death does not turn into life. Accordingly, death is understood as beyond death. Birth is a condition complete in this moment. Death is a condition complete in this moment. They are like winter and spring. You do not say that winter becomes spring or that spring becomes summer. So what does all this have to tell us about our life and our death? Remember that the entire passage is an analogy. By the end, Dogen has given us two different sets of concrete images as ways to think about life and death. First, he gives us the comparison of firewood and ash. And then, in this last paragraph, he gives us the transformation of the seasons as a way to point to the change of life and death. So here, as elsewhere, Dogen's point of view depends on his view of the nature of time. Remember that in Dogen's view, the only time we can actually experience is the present. From this point of view, when we're in life, life is all we can experience. Life, he implies, is just this very moment of life here and now. Life is not to be seen as an interval between birth on the one hand and death on the other hand. It is just living this very moment. For when we are in this very moment, that is all there is. Life is all there is. So what he's saying here is life is like firewood. It is a condition unto itself. Death is like ash. It is a condition unto itself. Spring is like summer, a condition unto itself. So ultimately, Dogen teaches that both life and death are empty. Whether we are alive or dead, we are empty and formless. There is nothing permanent or solid about either life or death. When we are in life, we think we are solid and permanent, but actually we are this constant flow that's going forward. There's no way we can grasp either life or death. There's just an unstoppable flow. So we could ask, who is born, who dies? This being said, it's necessary to understand that from the relative time-bound human point of view, there is life and death. There is coming and going. Dogen's last line says, you do not say that winter becomes spring or that spring becomes summer. So Dogen says, actually in English we do say that. So it's, for English speakers it's a little ambiguous. So what Dogen is saying when he claims that we don't say this is that winter, spring, and summer are just positions in time. Just as life is a position in time, and death is a position in time. Just as firewood is a position in time in the life of a tree, and ash is a position in time in the life of a tree. We can only experience one of these conditions at a time. If we're experiencing a tree in the condition of firewood, we cannot simultaneously experience it in the condition of ash. It's only in our minds that we can conjure both conditions at once. And the same is true of life and death, you know. When we're in life, we can only experience life. But we can think about death, which we do, which is part of our anxiety in this world. When you're in death, you're not going to be thinking about death. Dogen's paradoxical teaching here is that all opposites contain the other. Yet despite this paradox, Dogen's teachings are quite in line with Buddhist teaching. It's one life. It's one whole thing. One precious human life that can only be experienced one moment at a time. So how will you spend this precious human life? And how much of it will you actually be present for? And how much of it will you spend in your head, far away from this very moment?